God's got to break the little boxes that we've put around ourselves and God at the same time. We need to get creative.
Jesus answered him, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone."
There's a type of love that is intended for all creation, and we're actually doing exactly what's been intended. We're listening to one another. We're participating in this. And so to actually dream and go, what might we do together? What might I make with this pen and this paper? What would I make with this family in the next year that we have together with the kids, or whatever those things are? What would I make with this? And really open up and say, I don't know all there is to know about this. So what could there be? How could I be surprised? Where's the wonder?
This is our church sign, which seems to be starting to fall apart, but reminds us that no matter where we are on life's journey, we are all welcome here. And so on it we put a bird.
Putting a halo on it. Hey, that looks kind of good, I think, you know. I like that. Yeah, that could go there. Doesn't that kind of look natural? Yeah.
So hovering is kind of not like a helicopter mom that's anxious, but more hovering in a place of wholeness, of kind of what is this this gift I've been given, this opportunity, and how do I kind of box this opportunity and dig into it?
Hi, welcome to Darkwood Brew, where ancient Christian mystical practice is blended with modern interactive web technology, jazz, arts, biblical scholarship, and well, you never know exactly what's going to happen. I'm Eric Ellis, your host, and we've been joined throughout this series so far by Troy Bronsink, a Cincinnati-based artist, musician, and Presbyterian minister who's got a great book out called Drawn In, all about living the creative life. And during this series, we have been exploring six aspects of following a creative life, noting that what works for simply inspiring creative thought also has deep connections, and ancient ones, to spiritual formation and following the spiritual path. In week one, we looked at the process of dreaming. In the secular world, dreaming is blue skying, brainstorming, coming up with the big picture. We also noted that in the spiritual realm, that also has to do with dreaming God's dream, discerning God's activity in the world, realizing that we are a part of God's dream. God simply isn't just a subset of ours. We moved on last week to hovering, the process of hovering in the secular environment, creative thinking. Hovering is chunking things down, kind of going from that brainstorming into a tighter and tighter idea that fits where you're going. In the spiritual path, a similar process takes place, but it also involves testing the vision of God's dream and then determining your particular calling to it, so that you don't do the wrong good, but only the good you are called to do. Tonight, it's about risk. So at some point, we've got to, once we've found God's dream or a sense of it and our particular calling into it, we've got to take that first step forward. But that's kind of difficult sometimes. Risk means you can fail. Well, Helen Keller once made the observation that security is mostly a superstition. It does not exist in nature. Avoiding danger is no safer in the long run than outright exposure. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing. We'll be exploring that daring adventure tonight at Darkwood Brew. But first, let's let the band take us in.
Thank you. That was great. For our Numa Divina, we're creating a pool of brewers who will be with us and create videos for us each week in the coming weeks. If you're interested in participating in Darkwood Brew in that way, please send us an email. There's an email button on the website. And send us your contact information. We'll be in contact with you to arrange that. Our first reading of the Pneuma, just take in the passage as a whole. And this week, Nicholas Obradovich is sharing the Pneuma with us. Nicholas, Nicholas is around here every week. He's our head audio-visual engineer and an integral part of what we do at Darkwood Brew every week. And so we're excited to have Nicholas with us. He mixes songs for bands, and he enjoys taking photos of things that grab his eye. So let's have a listen together.
For it is as if a man, going on a journey, summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents, see? I have made 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Weeping, outer darkness, that sounds kind of harsh. Well, we'll be getting into that passage a little bit later on, but it's a passage that oftentimes confuses people. Just a note about that right up front. Talent in that passage, by the way, that was Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. A talent isn't a skill like in modern English. A talent was a unit of money. It was the equivalent of 6,000 denarii. 1 denarius was worth the equivalent of a single day's wages for a day laborer. So if you were to translate that into modern terms, just in Nebraska, for instance, the minimum wage here is $7.25 an hour times 8 hours a day times 6,000. 1 talent is about $350,000. So it's a lot of money. But we oftentimes kind of wonder what's going on. Is this master who seems to be standing in for God, or be a metaphor for God? Is God a greedy tyrant? Just what is the money serving as a metaphor for? What is, in a sense, the coin of the realm that Jesus is referring to? Well, we'll we'll get into that, as I say, a little later. But first, we want to simply acknowledge that Chris Alexander is not with us this evening. She is actually was a keynote speaker this afternoon at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, for their Aging with Passion and Purpose conference. It's a conference that is exploring the intersection between aging and technology, helpful uses of technology. And she has invited the whole conference. It's a 2-day conference, goes today and tomorrow. She invited the whole conference to stick around. They ended just a couple minutes ago, and they are tuning in to Darkwood Brew Live. So welcome, those of you who are at that conference. It's good to have you with us. By the way, I don't know if you've heard or not, but speaking of aging and technology, I don't know if you've heard of the Match.com, the new dating site for aging folks. It's called carbon dating. Okay, well, don't send cards and letters to me, please. But I was put up to it. No, actually, that's something that we took from NPR yesterday. So from Wait, Don't Tell Me. But we want to turn, before going to Troy Bronsink and kind of some exploration of this process of risking, turn to Brimfield, Massachusetts, where Ian Lynch and his church have been reading through Troy's book, Drawn In, where he suggests various exercises associated with each aspect of the creative process. So this is what Brimfield, Massachusetts turned up for the process of risk.
Today's exercise called us to name risks that we have procrastinated, things we have failed to do because of our fears. And in that process, then to offer that to God in the form of a prayer. It's a rather personal and quite private exercise for many of us, but out of it we did gather a prayer that was shared in our worship today. O God, the risk taker, thank you for your perfect love poured out on me, casting out my fear. But I need you to turn up the pressure. I have only put my toes in that holy water. The messiness of my fears cannot be washed away with that dabbling. Perhaps a sprinkle in the face can awaken me to let go of the fear of losing the familiarity and comfort of the known present. But I need a blast from your gracious hose if I am going to release my anxiety about how I am perceived by others, and risk the criticisms that may be littered on the path to the future that you dream for me. Push me off the diving board into the deep end of your eternal love, where I may float sustained by you, free from all fear of any failure, because you took the risk first to create me in your image, that I might succeed when I accept the gift of being fully the human you made, just like Jesus did, in whose name I pray. Amen.
What a great prayer. I feel like Ian, you should have warned us before praying so dangerously. That was a fantastic prayer. Thank you so much, First Congregational Church from Brimfield. Well, we're going to turn now to Troy Bronsink, and Troy, rather than going straight to questions about risk, Troy has actually got a fantastic song that deals with risk-taking and what happens when we grasp something too tightly. Troy, what is the song you're going to share with us this evening?
The song is "Hold On to These Things, but Don't Hold Them So Tightly." It's I think we started it, maybe it was 4 or 5 years ago. It was with a community, and we were trying to talk about that combination of the things that we're called to hold and steward and the things we're supposed to set free, and the tension that's there. And it actually is drawn on the passage that we're doing the Pneuma Divina on.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, let's hear it.
All right. I'm going to have to take my headphones off to do this, so here we go. Hold on to these things, but don't hold them so tightly, 'cause what you hold so tightly you no longer hold for me, but for you hold on to these things, but don't hold them so tightly, 'cause what you hold so tightly, you no longer hold for me, but for you. Hold on to these things, but don't hold them so tightly, 'cause what you hold so tightly, you no longer hold for me, but for you. Hold on to these things, but don't hold them so tightly, 'cause what you hold so tightly, you no longer hold for me, but for you. Hold on to these things, but don't hold them so tightly, 'cause what you hold so tightly, you no longer hold for me, but for you. Hold on to these things for me. Hold on to these things with me. Hold on to these things with me. Hold on to these things with me. Won't you hold on to these things, but don't hold them so tightly, 'cause what you hold so tightly, you no longer hold for me, but for you. Hold on to these things, but don't hold them so tightly, 'cause what you hold so tightly, you no longer hold for me, but for you.
Thanks, Troy. That's great. Beautiful music, and that comes from your CD, as they're called, Music to Pray By.
Songs to pray
Song
by.
to Pray By. I got that wrong last week too. I've only listened to
Maybe
it
it
about
should be
20
called Music to Pray by.
Yeah, I've only listened to it about 25 times, but I always listen to it in my iPod, so I don't get the title. I don't have the jacket in front of me.
Yeah,
So
that works.
yeah, great stuff. Great stuff. So hold on. It seems like whenever we take a risk to grasp something, we do have to let go of something as well as take hold of something. Why is that so hard for us?
I mean, I think a lot of times we confuse our identity with the projects that we're working on. The various projects we have, we either think these are completely ours, and so we have to hold on to them in order for our integrity to stand up, so somebody doesn't misjudge me. But I think also, as people of faith, we confuse God's identity with the projects we're holding. Mm-hmm. And so we're scared that, like, we're going to ruin God's reputation if we screw this one up, you know? And so we're kind of holding it back, thinking we're holding it for God, thinking we're proving how, protecting God from the other criticisms that could happen if this thing was just left open outside of our control. And in turn, what ends up happening is it becomes domesticated further and further by the things that we're afraid of, by those inner critics. And
so, like, what would be an example of that happening?
I mean, I think, it's easy to make a parallel to say, church programming and different work that you do with communities of faith, where if you actually were to change how you were doing, say, an outreach program or a worship program, and actually switch it up, you might be afraid, well, this is actually going to affect our reputation in the community. If a great example here in the community that I'm in northern Cincinnati, the church for years had volunteered driving into the city to work at a soup kitchen as part of City Gospel. And it was a great project, and a lot of folks had years of memories of going down and taking this pilgrimage into the city. And now the ministry of City Gospel has come all the way to our community as first ring suburbs here, and is doing a lot of work with public schools here, where the schools here are great, a lot of kids are involved in them. But as they're getting involved in tutoring programs and those things, we realized we need to focus our energies on our neighbors here in our immediate community, also folks that are in places of risk, but it's a little less, I don't know, it feels less traditional to drive a couple blocks to a school and tutor a kid who lives in a neighborhood next to ours or in your same neighborhood, who might, for a variety of situations, not be in a position to, they could really use this tutoring and this kind of connection. That feels scarier than driving downtown with spaghetti once a month to do the service. And so when City Gospel asked us to make that shift, that was a difficult change for the church, because we were afraid, what will that look like to people in the congregation? Will they feel like we're now not a community of service? And you have to go, well, the situation has changed, the context has changed, and how can I be more responsive to this situation?
Yeah. It reminds me of just even language itself. I remember long ago reading the Russian literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin talking about double voice discourse, how our words, like take even theological language, when we say Jesus saves, or God is active in my life, so things like this, or even the word God, it's really kind of has two parts. There's the word that comes out of our mouth, but there's also what the listener, so that has certain meaning. When I say God, that has meaning to me, but when that reaches your ear, you put meaning into it yourself that I can't control. And so every time I use a word like God or salvation or Jesus or prayer or Holy Spirit, any of these words that have so much depth and significance in our tradition, I've lost control of half the word just because I've spoken it. And as whole cultures shift, that what people invest in the other side of that word shifts over time. And so if our language isn't nuanced, isn't nimble, if we aren't willing to kind of hold language lightly and keep it bouncing, we can use the same old language. It could have no meaning at all to the people we're speaking to, or have even worse, negative meaning, the opposite meaning, what we're even intending.
Yeah, that's good. Language is a lot like that. But I think physicality is the same thing when you move into a material sphere. So an artist has an idea in her mind of what will happen on the canvas. But then when she has to take those first jots and begin to create that space, it gets riskier because it gets concrete. And I think our life is a lot of times that way. You make a decision with your fifth grader what school they're going to go to, and the risk seems like this could have these huge ramifications, you think, and you build them up in your mind, and you don't know if you should even take the risk. Somebody on the chat said, when's the right timing for taking a risk? And it's like, well, that's part of the word risk. Like, you don't know the right timing. I think that the physicality is a big deal there. What is it? Reminded of Cornel West, who would say that justice is what love looks like in public. Justice is what love looks like in public. And I think that we often don't try new forms of justice or developing our forms of justice because we're afraid of getting our hands dirty. And we might look like we didn't take the right step. So it's sometimes better just not to be in the forefront taking any steps. Yeah. And I think the rhythms of creativity are kind of this. There's good news in that God didn't remain simply in this triune relationship with God's self, but moved from an introvertive to an extrovertive relationship with things. There were suddenly, if you just imagine this moment when God says, let there be light, like before that, light hadn't functioned other than in God's imagination. And now there was physically light, just kind of go through your mind of like, what would that feel like for the Creator to not know that thing until it actually happened in the physical space in front of you? And however you think about what what God was doing during creation and what we're handed as these tools to understand it. We are handed this poetry that uses the imagery of creativity, of the creator imposing a vision upon a material space, and out of that coming something that's reflective of God's character, that's loving and interrelated. So God takes this risk also. So there, we should be encouraged that maybe it's dangerous, but it's not reckless to simply move out of that place of hovering, where we're beginning to focus on what would this look like when it rolls out, and begin to prototype and begin to see what it looks like when you're playing it out in real life.
So when is it appropriate to take a risk, and when is it not? When I can imagine a lot of people they're faced with a whole wide variety of potential risks in their life, and wondering, well, when do I pull the trigger on this, and when do I say, hey, this time hasn't come, or this isn't a good risk?
It's interesting. I think that maybe if we go with those patterns of dreaming and hovering, in those dreaming and hovering stages, you're creating practices in your life of readiness and awareness. So you can actually hear invitation. And I think invitation can come from the master in the parable that we read, where there's actually a moment where somebody says, here's these many talents, here's these many coins of the realm, now do something with them. And you look at them and you're like, what am I going to do with them? So it's a really clear moment. You have to make that decision. But then there's other times where it's not as clear, and others around you challenge you to do that. And some of it, I think the third piece of how you would know, I'm on the fly here, but would be from vocation. I remember first time I read Anne Lamont's book, Bird by Bird. She talks about the writing life. And she talks about one writer who comes and comes rushing in the door, takes his coat off and sits in front of his typewriter and works for about 10 minutes, and then it starts to dribble away. He has to put his coat back on, go back out of the house, then come rushing back in the house, take his coat off and start writing. And that's the discipline of taking those risks. And so I think when you look at this creative cycle and you recognize I'm not a risk person, I'm not a risk taker, how can you trust the folks in your community to encourage you around those risks? How can you create these small little risks that kind of create a lubricant, that kind of loosen up the gears so that you can move out of the hovering space, which can sometimes be more controlling, into a more expansive space?
Yeah. Reminded of the poet David White, who talks about the discipline of poetry is overhearing yourself saying things before you're quite ready to say them.
Oh, it's perfect. That's really good.
Yeah.
That's good. I think communities also are really, they have these rhythms or don't have these rhythms. Like, in other words, communities are creative beings as well. And you can recognize where different communities are in places of writer's block, where there's not a new iteration. And some of what they're continuing to do in a performative stage is to stay in the prior iteration and try to do everything they can to leverage that old story. And they keep talking about themselves in second person, like we Presbyterians, or in third person. Like there's those kind of ways that communities do that. We talked before about Csikszentmihalyi, the author of Flow. And in there he says that there's two tendencies of community. One is the expansive tendency, and one is the conserving tendency. And so what belongs to art and creativity are all these expansive tendencies. But what belongs to management and, in a sense, good stewardship, is the conserving tendency. How do you make sure there's not a hole in the bottom of your pocket so that whatever you're putting things in fall out? Well, then you take time to darn your pockets. Well, that's kind of conserving. That's not really exciting design work. And so I think that knowing how, with our kids and with our faith communities and with our schools, to create expansive tendencies, that also helps you learn how to move into this risk-taking. Because otherwise you don't know those other horizons if you don't try to look into them.
Yeah. Seems like that also raises the issue of tradition versus, living tradition versus a dead tradition, or traditioning versus tradition, where oftentimes, like for instance, a faith community will carry on something because, well, that's what our ancestors did. That's the tradition. And yet, if you really look at what our ancestors did, it was actually responded to the needs of the moment and took what their ancestors had done and then you made them work in their day and carried them forward in a new way. So you look at the whole Old and New Testaments, you find all kinds of changes, morphs and changes in the thought and their understandings of just basic principles like the Ten Commandments even, and how we apply them in our day and so forth, that kept changing over time. And to me, that if we're going to talk about tradition, we have to talk about that's really a process, engaging in a process, not simply taking whatever came before and carrying it forward.
Mm-hmm. There's an idea that there's our origins and our finished places, and that we're located in the present, which is a place where our meaning is found in our origins, but we're also pulled towards an unfinished or a finished product, and there's this kind of unfinished space in the middle. So I think another word for risk is kind of coming to terms with our unfinishedness.
Yeah.
And that's a really liberating notion, the grace of God freeing us to step into unfinished places instead of shame about being unfinished. Recognizing that it's continually unfolding. And so in this moment, what will we do with playing it where it lands right here?
Yeah. Well, we're going to turn to our Pneuma passage again. We're going to read a little shorter version that you heard at the front of the episode. We'll be looking at Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. This is at the point where that third individual is then giving his account of things. And just to kind of preface this reading, we asked up front, what is the coin of the realm? That what is the metaphor going on here? You may want to consider, for instance, instead of a financial metaphor, what if what's been given those stewards or those servants is, for instance, grace or love or forgiveness or generosity? How would this parable play out with the first two coming back and doubling their investment, taking the risks on these things in order to grow them, and then this third servant? Let's hear this passage. We'll hear it 3 times, and we'll have instructions about how to kind of to engage with the passage each time. But this first reading, simply listen to the passage and consider what word or phrase sticks out for you. What word or phrase just kind of stays in your mind, and then consider every iteration of that word or phrase that you can think of in your life. Let's hear Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30.
Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid. And I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow, and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him, and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
During this next reading, we invite you to listen once again and then hold that word or that phrase up next to a situation where you are particularly dealing with that. Do I take a risk or do I not?
Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I do not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
During this final reading, we invite you simply to listen and then carry on that conversation that you just started, or simply let go of it all and simply rest in the presence.
Then the one who had received 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow, and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own, with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
going to transition to our musical feature this evening, but while we're in that musical feature, if you happen to have comments or questions arising from your experience of this passage, if you're on live chat, we invite you to share those with us, and we'll be taking your questions and comments afterwards as we explore this passage with Troy Bronsink. Matt, who do we have with us this evening?
Yeah, let me introduce the fellows quickly. Matt Amandus on the keyboards, Carlos Figueroa on the drums, and Steve Gomez on the bass. And, of course, it's never a risk to play a brand new Chuck Moronic tune. This is called Here in This Place, featuring Carol Rogers.
Sizzle, guys. Woo! Yeah. In his holy temple.
Carol. And thank you also, Chuck Moronic. Wonderful. He's just been really riding up a storm lately. And also, by the way, next week we'll have a special attachment to Chuck. He has donated his studio piano in Louisville to Darkwood Brew, which is a fantastic piano. We'll actually have it with us here next week and featuring that piano as a permanent feature of Darkwood Brew. So looking forward to that, and thank you so much, Chuck, for that belief in us. Well, we want to turn to Troy now, and we've got this really kind of edgy piece of our passage this evening, and where this guy is, he's buried his talent in the ground, and now this master's kind of upset about that. And Troy, was there a line or a phrase that particularly resonated for you in this passage?
That gathering where you do not scatter kind of kept coming around to me, and I don't know. It's even as it's kind of interpreted at the end, and the master saying back to the fearful guy, "You knew I was this way, and yet you acted this way." So I guess in that case, the master's okay with that definition, that self-definition of somebody who is, part of that master's brand is that master gathers where he doesn't scatter. So it's kind of like, and then harvest where he doesn't sow. It just kept me thinking how much of that can be a form of abundance, that if we use the language of the master being God and the kingdom of God sort of sense, how much of it is God's propensity to pick it from wherever and be fine with that. Like, not like, well, is this a place where one of my commissioned people planted something? But just to go like, well, that's love, and I'm going to bring that into fullness too. That's beautiful. And how that's only threatening if you're afraid of the brand. Like that, like this fearful servant, with the one talent, was like, I knew you did that kind of work, so because of your reputation, I hid it under the mattress. It was just too much to think about throwing my seed into that circulation of all this other stuff.
Interesting. Yeah. I wonder, I've been kind of turning that idea of, for instance, grace, if that was the coin of the realm, that's what the talent represents, and I wonder if really, if you bisect it with that notion, you've got these first two stewards, and they are taking a risk on grace. And the best definition of grace I ever heard is when I was a kid, a children's sermon. The minister said, grace is either receiving something that you didn't earn, or not receiving something you did earn or deserve. So we take a risk on grace. We multiply grace out there. What are we doing? We're taking a risk by offering people a generosity that maybe they didn't earn, they didn't deserve, but in hopes of transformation. Or we are withholding something we could, they're just desserts, so to speak, for that same reason. It's a risk, though, because sometimes people you be generous and they kind of take advantage of you. But apparently these first two are continually doing this in order to grow, create that transformation that grace does in us, and so they keep offering it. Whether they win or lose, they know that grace ultimately wins. And you got this third person who's basically saying, well, gosh, he's kind of got this feeling that like the master is not gracious at all. That if he's going to offer grace, that's too risky. If you take a risk on grace, what happens if you lose? What's the master going to think? He's not thinking of God as a gracious giver at all. He's kind of got God in this box, and God has become a part of his dream rather than him a part of God's dream.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, we talked last week about put a halo on it, and I think at a certain point, the halo maybe becomes a silo in a sense. Like when you say this is the holy place, and God's grace is this way, and here's how we've defined it now theologically and methodologically and whatever. And so it begins to become kind of this cylinder that you're caught in, and only this type of grace is what's available, and we're holding it with that kind of tightness.
Yeah.
We're not free to jump back out.
Yeah, I think that all kinds of kind of Christian movements kind of are get really scary when we will not take a risk on God's grace. We'll say, well, it's safer to actually be the strictest you possibly can, because if you're wrong and God is more gracious, then then great. But if you're right, then you're not going to endure punishment then. So people try to make the faith as strict as possible, just on the off chance that God might not be the gracious God that we believe that God may be, and therefore we start really withholding that from the world, putting it in the ground, not taking risks with it. And I think that what seems like the parable is trying to suggest, that actually failure to risk on your grace is actually far more dangerous than giving too much of it away.
It's almost like it smothers it, so it no longer is grace. And so, like, to steward grace is to let those. It's like with the flames in a campfire. You have to let the oxygen keep getting to it for them to burn. And if you hold it in and try to guard it from all the oxygen, then it's no longer grace. It's something that's you can hold again. It's no longer hot. It's just plain ashes or wood, And so to steward grace is to open it up. It's a fun play to think of it as grace that way. Yeah. Somebody asked in the questions in the chat about fear, and in really seeing this person as in a sense a personification of fear. I think of that imagery of perfect love casts out all fear, and so then this casting stuff, which it's hard it's tempting to want to domesticate that part of that. More than half of the Numa Divina was like some really bad news about this guy with the one talent that hid it under his mattress, right?
Yeah.
But what does it mean if fear is cast out, and no longer is a operative participant in the kingdom of God sowing and reaping work?
Right. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. It seems like if you have received grace, generosity, forgiveness, love, and you're not willing to give it away, take risks on it, you are already in the outer darkness. And it's not the master's throwing the person out. The person's there, already. I wonder how much, even if it, like, again, to use grace as the coin in the realm, and you can run this through these other pieces, I wonder how much that person was even willing to receive grace for himself. I mean, he's able to turn it back over to the master, without diminishment. Maybe this person never even was willing, was such a stingy kind of tightwad that he couldn't even imagine that God would be generous towards him. Was refusing that. Interesting. Well, we have a couple of questions that have been arising here. One is from the coffee house. Tracy has it for us. Tracy?
Yeah, we had the comments or discussion in the coffee house tonight kind of centered around the last verse and the weeping and gnashing of teeth, and this description of what sounded to this person as hell. So we're wondering, is the consequence of not taking risk, is it that hell? Is it that weeping and gnashing of teeth? Is that, or what's the tie in there?
Is that one to me? There's some risk.
Yes, it
I'm going to risk
is.
giving that one back to Eric. And that's funny. I do wonder if how hell operates as a motivator. Not only, we've had some good discussions in the 3 weeks we've been together already, and as I've watched Darkwood, the work you guys have done around what is this concept of hell as a motivator, as an understanding of eternity and how God relates or doesn't relate to us beyond the present and all that. Yeah. But I do think that there is, in this story, whatever we make of this master, there is the efficiency of the coin of the realm is increased by not having people in play who misunderstand what the coin is for. There's something about like it's just not generative to have. It's almost like I hate using investment banking as a picture. Maybe let's just do sowing, like sowing of a farm. But if somebody doesn't understand the principles yet of planting the seed in a soil where it can get richness and watering it in a way where it can flourish and thinking about the sun and those sort of things, at a certain point, don't keep handing them seeds. Teach them how the rest of this works. And so in this case, the master who has these walls and a kingdom and is determining who's inside and outside of those walls is sorting that out based on who understands the freedom to take risks. So I don't know if this is a teaching. I mean, this is a teaching about the kingdom of heaven, not about the kingdom of gnashing of teeth. But whatever these gnashing of teeth places are, they're a place outside of that abundance. And so the invitation is always implied, come be part of the abundance. So I don't think motivating people with hell and gnashing of teeth is going to help them take bigger risks. In fact, it's the reverse. You're trying to figure out, risk aversion. I want to avoid hell, so what do I do that's good? Well, that's the wrong way to go after this. This is more like at the end of the story, what happens if there's not that kind of good investment? Well, it's just not helpful. It's not part of the intended currency. The gift is no longer free to circulate.
Yeah, it seems like that whole notion of heaven and hell actually kind of does put a finer point on this parable, in a sense that if you look at the Bible, passages in the Bible, there's some passages in the Bible that could be construed as indicating there is some sort of eternal torture place you go to. There are other passages you read and they seem to clearly be talking about a universal salvation, and you say, well, boy, which one do I go with here? And there is a sense in which when we think about there being a truly loving God, it does not make sense to most thinking people that there would be a God who, out of love, would cast people forever into a torture chamber with no hope of ever getting out for failing to please this God in a certain way. However, since any of us who are also thinking people could always be wrong in our thoughts, we say, well, that can't be right. What if there's a 10% chance you're wrong about that, or even a 2% chance? When you're talking about eternity, eternal torture, it's like, my gosh, well, maybe I ought to just treat God as if God does this then, so that, again, if I die and I learn that that's all just a fiction, then I'm great. But if I died and that's real, then I played it safe. And maybe I better to also, what about my kids and my wife and the people who I don't even know? Maybe we ought to really assume that God is the worst kind of God possible, so that we're all safe in case we die, and God really is that way. To me, that suddenly you're right in the shoes of that third servant. I'm going to assume that God is the harshest taskmaster possible, so I'm not going to give away any of this grace. I'm not going to take any risks on God's grace, because that's too dangerous. And that at some point, that actually becoming a new creation that Jesus talks about is about taking a risk, that God is more gracious than you can imagine, not less. And that's the deep intuition of our nature and our nature's connection to the divine, is that God is more gracious than us, not less.
Well, and it goes back again to that holding tightly, that we, as we keep refining who God is in order to keep ourselves safe, we keep bracketing out who else God is, and in a sense, God keeps wanting to break that open. And this story is that invitation into, I am more than simply the one who picks up where I haven't sowed and scattered. I'm also all of these other things. And if you limit it to this, it's a really dark, painful place.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Scott Frederickson has been monitoring the internet chat, as I know you have too. But Scott, have you found other questions or comments that came out this evening?
No, because Troy's on chat, he stole the question. So.
Stole the question. It's great to have a guest on chat.
It is. You know, we love having our guests on chat, and Troy has been very helpful over the last 3 weeks, actually, being on chat as well, to be there for us. So thanks, Troy.
Well, it's probably just as well because we're actually headed overtime. Well, Troy, we're looking forward to next week. What's ahead next week? What's the next aspect of the creative process that we're tracing?
Next week is listening, and I think a lot of this is some of what maybe the servants with the 2 talents and the 5 talents did, and that was the freeing the gift to circulate in the wider community, and then learning from that, which is what the master wanted them to do. So this, we might do all these prototypes and all these risks, but then at a certain point you have to understand how your experiments, how your risks relate to the world in which you're located. And so listening is this process, that discernment process of understanding how our work, whether anything from art to activism to our faith community and our faith practices, how it fits within our everyday life and the context in which we live, and evaluating it that way. So that's called listening.
Fantastic. We'll look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and also offering your beautiful music once again.
You bet. Thanks, Ed.
Well, when I think of what's the scariest passage in the entire Bible, there's a few, but one of those, the most frightening passages has to do with risk-taking. It's when Abraham hears this call from God to sacrifice his own son, on the altar, to take Isaac, his only beloved son, and actually sacrifice him on that altar, and yet. And there's a lot of that's been written on that on that passage, and people really struggle with it. But ultimately, what the author is trying to show is that when God calls you into something that even just scares you off the ends of the spectrum, if it's truly God calling you, it's actually the safest place you can be. Isaac was in no safer place in the entire world than on the altar that God had asked him to be on. He was perfectly safe on God's altar. Yet 2,000 years later, there was another altar that we're familiar with, the altar that is symbolized by this meal. It was not God's altar, it was the altar of the world, and another son was upon it. The world called Jesus to that altar, and it was the most dangerous place you could possibly be. There's the altar of God, the altar of the world. One is perfectly safe, even though it is scarier than hell. And the other place is just plain hell. But in this meal, in which we invite you to share, if you've got elements at home, bread or wine, juice and crackers, we are reminded that Jesus went to hell and back. Even there is not a place that is too far away for God's love, for God's grace. For we're reminded on a night of betrayal and desertion, Jesus took bread, and thinking of that altar in which he would be laid, he said, "My friends, this is my body, which is broken for you. Do this as often as you eat of it in remembrance of me." So likewise, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink of it in remembrance of me." By eating this bread and drinking this cup, we remember Christ's death. We celebrate Christ's resurrection. And we know that whether we follow God's call to God's altar, or whether the world puts us on its own, God's grace and love and forgiveness and generosity is capable of meeting us there, wherever we may be, transforming us truly into a new creation. The gifts of God for the people of God. I invite you to join us in the feast.
Lord. Take my hand, lead me on, help me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn through the storm, through the night. Oh, precious Lord, lead me to your light. Oh, precious Lord, take my hand, lead me home.
You certainly took us home. Thanks. Well, thanks for joining us this evening. We're glad you've been able to join us, and we're looking forward to seeing you next week as we continue the creative process with listening with Troy Bronsink. Until then, my friends, may the Spirit of the living God, made known to us most fully in Jesus Christ our Lord, go before you to show you the way, go above you to watch over you, go behind you to push you into places you may not necessarily go yourself, go beneath you to uphold you and uplift you, go beside you to be your strong companion, and dwell within you to remind you that you are surely not alone, and you are loved beyond your wildest imagination. And may the fire of God's blessing burn brightly upon you and within you, now and always. Amen.